Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for our friends overseas. I'm Myron Brilliant with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We're delighted to have our next InSTEP forum here today with Tony Blinken, the Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to the Biden campaign. Let me just begin by saying that we have a number of special guests who will join us here this morning, and we're delighted to have all of you around the world joining us for this session. This is the first time that we're going on the record. So for my friends in the press, this will be on the record, a break from our usual approach for the InSTEP forums. I think having a tremendous turnout today is not a big surprise. We're a little over 40 days from the national election in our country. And there's a great deal of interest in seeing how the candidates will approach the big and transformational issues of the day. There are stark differences that we'll talk about in the foreign policy arena, even though I know foreign policy issues rarely decide U.S. elections. Most Americans vote based on their party affiliation or on the domestic issues of the day, like taxes, jobs, of course, health. And in this environment, the pandemic is going to loom large over the national debate and the election season. That said, notwithstanding the impact of domestic issues in the 2020 election, the reality, of course, is we have transformational issues to address in the foreign policy arena. The consequences of this election will be critical to the future direction of American leadership around the world. So that's first glance, some of these issues, you won't think there's stark differences between the two candidates. For example, both President Trump and Vice President Biden have each indicated a strong desire to withdraw from American intervention overseas when it comes to military intervention, I should say. And on China, each has acted tough and has spoken very forcefully about China's behavior in trade, technology, and on national security issues. But you got to look closer. You got to look at the subtle differences in approach and style as we explore today where those differences are. And then in some areas like climate change, let's be honest, there are stark differences between the candidates. Today, we'll have the great pleasure of hearing from Tony Blinken, as I said, the Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to Vice President Biden, who will give his perspective on what those major differences mean for America's leadership around the world. And really, we couldn't ask for a better person, given his role on the campaign, to help us understand and help Americans understand what's at stake in these elections. Just briefly on Tony. Tony was raised in Europe in this regard, so was I. As a young boy, he attended grade school and high school in Paris, attending some school called Harvard as an undergraduate and then law school at Columbia. But I know that Tony struggled with the issue between politics and arts as a child. But when he entered politics, he probably made the most consequential decision in his life. And that's because that's when he met his future wife, Evan Ryan, at the White House in 1995, when she was a special assistant to Hillary Clinton, and he served as a special assistant then to President Bill Clinton, both in terms of senior director for speechwriting and more broadly in his role for the president. Throughout his 25 years in public service, he has really been in many senior positions, including as staff director of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which is where I first met him, and of course, eventually served and supported the chairman of that committee, Joe Biden. In time during the Obama administration, he served as National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden, and then later Deputy National Security Advisor in 2013 to President Obama. So there's a lot in his background that we could go through, and I know that he's an avid guitar player, that he loves Eric Clapton. We have time, we'll get into those areas, Tony, I assure you. But the most important thing is to hear from Tony. So let me jump right in here, Tony, with you, and thank you again for being with us today. Let me start by asking you how your experience living in France, and of course your stepfather's incredible and sad experience having been in Auschwitz and Dachau concentration camps, what these two experiences meant to you and how has it shaped your views around America's leadership in today's complex world. Tony?
Myron, good morning. Thank you
Morning.
for having me. It's wonderful to be with you always, and to be with an amazing group of folks from around the world. And I know these are trying times for so many of us. But you know, I think we're all the product of our families, what we talk about, what we hear about at the kitchen table. And in my case, you know, one of the things I heard about growing up was from parents and grandparents, virtually all of whom had been relatively recent immigrants to the United States, or refugees. My father's father, my grandfather, fled pogroms from what's now Ukraine back at the turn of the last century. A stepmother who came over here literally fleeing communism in the dead of night as a very young girl from Hungary. And then you mentioned my stepfather, my late stepfather, who passed away a couple of years ago, Samuel Pizar. He was one of 900 kids in his school in Białystok, Poland. He's the only one to have survived World War II. His mother, father, sister perished. All of his schoolmates did. And as you alluded to, he spent 4 years in work camps, concentration camps, pretty much a greatest hits, Majdanek, Dachau, Auschwitz. At the very end of the war, he was on a death march out of a camp in Bavaria and made a run for it, and somehow made it into the woods and was hiding out by day, moving around at night. And one day he heard a deep rumbling sound, and he looked out from his hiding place, and instead of seeing the dreaded Iron Cross, he saw a 5-pointed white star on a tank. And he made a run for it. He ran to the tank, which is probably pretty foolhardy given the battle that was going on, but somehow made it to the tank. The hatch opened up. A large African-American GI looked down at him, and he got down on his knees and said the only 3 words that he knew in English that his mother had taught him before the war: God bless America. And the GI leaned down from the tank hatch, picked him up, brought him into the tank, into freedom, and in effect into the United States. That's what I learned about growing up. That is what my country represents to me, and in many ways what it's represented to so many people around the world, and that I hope very much it will represent once again.
Tony, that's an amazing story, and I wish I had more time to go in depth on this, but I want to ask you what's going on right now. In a week's time, each candidate will be in a national debate forum and making their case to the American people why they should be elected to the President of the United States. What do you think will be Vice President Biden's strongest arguments about the post-pandemic world, and what will be the core tenets of the foreign policy agenda that he will try to outline to the American people in the debates?
You know, Myron, the next president's going to inherit 2 things: a divided country and a world increasingly in disarray. And when it comes to the latter, that's the part I get to deal with, the world in disarray. The question is, what can the United States do to help put our globe back, a little bit back on its axis? And I guess I'd sum it up in 3 words: leadership, cooperation, democracy, which also sums up for me the profound differences between President Trump and Joe Biden. And in that sense, I don't think the choice could be any clearer, or frankly, the contrast any starker. And let me just go through each one real quick. First, leadership. One of the things I've learned from doing this for 25 years is, whether we like it or not, the world tends not to organize itself. And until the Trump administration, the U.S. played a lead role, if not the lead role, in doing that organizing, helping to write the rules, shape the norms, animate the institutions that tend to govern relations among nations. Unfortunately, President Trump has abdicated that responsibility, putting America in full retreat from our allies, international organizations, from hard-won agreements that I suspect we'll get a chance to talk about. But here's the problem. When we're not engaged, when we don't lead, then one of 2 things. Either someone else does, some other country tries to take our place, but probably not in a way that advances our interests or values, or no one does, and then you get chaos. Either way, that is bad for the United States. I believe Joe Biden as president will reassert American leadership, leading with our diplomacy. We'll actually show up again, day in, day out. We'll try to engage the world not as it was in 2009, but as it is, and as we anticipate it will become. Rising powers, new actors who are super empowered by technology and information. We have to bring them along if we're going to make progress. And I think Joe Biden would act with humility. After all, most of the world's problems are not about us, even if they affect us. We just can't flip a switch to solve them. But also with confidence, because America at its best has a greater ability than any country to mobilize others for the greater good. Then there's cooperation. This is obvious, I think, to pretty much everyone taking part this morning. Not a single one of the big challenges we face, climate, mass migration, technological disruption, pandemic disease, not a single one can be met by one country acting alone, even one as powerful as the United States. And there's no wall high enough or wide enough to contain these challenges. But at the very time, we need to find new ways to cooperate and bring other countries along. By nearly every measure, the credibility and influence of the United States is in free fall under President Trump. You all have probably seen the most recent Pew Global Survey. People now have, in country after country, more confidence in Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping to do the right thing regarding world affairs than they do in the President of the United States. And the American people know it too. There was a Gallup survey, and this was, I think, before President Trump's disastrous handling of the coronavirus or the killing of George Floyd. 2/3 of Americans recognize that President Trump is not respected by other world leaders. So President Biden would have to pick up the pieces of this carnage. He will have to salvage our reputation, rebuild confidence in American leadership, and mobilize our country and our allies to rapidly meet new changes. Final thing, democracy. I remain convinced, and more important, Joe Biden remains convinced, that the best answer to the multitude of challenges we face is democracy. It reflects who we are, how we see ourselves, and at least until recently, how the world has tended to see us. But we know that democracy is being challenged as never before, and that matters as never before. The strength of American democracy here at home is directly tied to our ability to be a force for progress and to mobilize that collective action around the world. And yet, unfortunately, we have a president currently who's engaged in a daily assault on our own democracy, on its institutions, on its people, on its values. And that's deeply tarnished our ability to lead. And abroad, Myron, on the other side, other democracies are a source of strength for the United States, especially when we find ways to act together. But I think a lot of us know this. Democracy has been in retreat. Freedom House, which ranks countries around the world for decades on democratic metrics, of the 41 countries consistently ranked fully free in the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, fully half have fallen backwards. There's a democratic recession. Autocracies from Russia to China in different ways are trying to exploit and add fuel to our troubles. And yet at the very moment, democracies are looking to the United States to be a leader of the free world. President Trump, by embracing autocrats, by dissing Democrats, and as the leading consumer and purveyor of conspiracy theories, seems to have suited up for the other side. I believe that Joe Biden as president will actually focus on renewing our democracy at home, but also revitalizing our alliances with democracies abroad. He has an opportunity, and I think by his character and by his approach, an opportunity to actually bring us together as Americans, but also as a community of democracies. And as he likes to say, the United States can once again lead not only by the example of its power, but by the power of its example.
Tony, you laid out some very ambitious goals. I want to ask you about the political limits. Right now, this country is very inward facing when it comes to conducting a recovery plan, focusing on the pandemic and the health of our society with limited resources. And I've got to ask you this because I serve on the board of the USGLC, the Global Leadership Coalition. It's always fighting for the foreign affairs budget. Tony, how do you accomplish your mission knowing there's going to be such a great deal of emphasis domestically? What are the limits on that? What are the constraints that you're going to face coming out if Biden were to win in November, what would you be doing? What would you be prioritizing? Before we get into specific topics, just how do you focus your resources?
Myron, look, you're 110% right. And I think we have to start by facing facts, which is that COVID-19 itself is the gravest challenge the United States has faced since World War II. It's killed more Americans than died during World War I, and it's killed more Americans than in every war the United States has fought since 1945, plus 9/11 combined. The recession it's unleashed represents, I think, the deepest downturn since the Great Depression. Millions of Americans unemployed, entire sectors of our economy threatened or even, in some cases, in ruin. On top of that, we've got a lot of tails that could be wagging the COVID dog. An emerging markets debt crisis, food insecurity, migratory upheavals, humanitarian disasters, and then more protectionism, more nationalism, more xenophobia, all of which can ricochet back on the United States or even emanate from the United States. So, in a sense, the pandemic is a national security crisis of the first order. But here's the thing. I think that getting out from under the COVID rock requires asserting American leadership, including global leadership, not running away from it. Think about it this way. I mean, a lot of us will remember this. Previous crises, nothing of this magnitude, but big ones. HIV/AIDS, the 2008-2009 financial crisis, Ebola. American administrations, Republican and Democratic, led the way internationally to mobilize the international community, to forge cooperation, to forge coordination. The Bush administration with HIV/AIDS did a remarkable job saving so many lives. President Obama, again, with the financial crisis and then Ebola. We seized the G7, the G20, international financial institutions. And there is no question that the downsides of each of these were significantly mitigated, and we were able to turn around much more quickly and effectively thanks to American leadership. This time, when COVID broke out, the United States was chairing the G7. We didn't even call a meeting. It took President Macron in France to do that. The G20, in the absence of US leadership, has been totally ineffectual. And of course, at the same time, the truth is the world's not taking a time out in other areas just because of COVID-19. So I don't think we have the luxury of approaching this sequentially. We've got to be able to walk and chew a lot of gum at the same time. Oh. So job one is to get COVID under control. And there are a series of things that go along with that, including investments in our own economy on the economic side. But we have a whole series of other commitments around the world that we'll have to start with on day one. One of them, of course, is getting back into the Paris Climate Accord.
Okay, so let's get into the topical issues of the day. Let's start with China, because it's no doubt the most consequential relationship the United States faces in the foreseeable future. President Trump has suggested that Biden would be weak in dealing with China, going as far as saying if Joe Biden became president, China would own the United States. And in fact, President Trump deserves credit for negotiating a phase one deal with China and moving the needle a little bit forward. Does China, either the party or the state, pose an existential threat to the United States? And how would a Biden administration deal with the complexity of issues with China differently than the current administration, from Taiwan to Hong Kong to Xinjiang to obviously the trade and technology issues? How would the framework be different than the Trump administration?
So, Myron, very much agree with the proposition that China poses a growing challenge. It's arguably the biggest challenge we face from another nation state, economically, technologically, militarily, even diplomatically. The relationship has adversarial aspects, competitive aspects, but also some cooperative ones. I don't think the question is who's tough or who's weak on China. The question is who has the most effective strategy to protect and advance our security, our prosperity, our values. And I think we have to start by putting ourselves in a position of strength from which to engage China so the relationship moves forward more on our terms and less on theirs. Here's the problem. Right now, by every key metric, China's strategic position is stronger and America's strategic position is weaker as a result of President Trump's leadership. the president has helped China advance its own key strategic goals, weakening American alliances, leaving a vacuum in the world for China to fill, abandoning our own values, and so giving Beijing a green light to trample on human rights and democracy in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and maybe worst of all, debasing our own democracy and so reducing its appeal. In many ways, when you think about it, the China challenge is less about their strength and more about our self-inflicted weaknesses. Put another way, it's about us, the competitiveness of our economy and workers, of our democracy and political system, of our alliances and partnerships, of our values, all of which, in my judgment, President Trump has done so much to undermine, but all of which are actually fully within our control. So what a Biden presidency would do to put ourselves in a position of strength is to invest in ourselves, to renew our own democracy, to work with our partners, to assert our values. That's how you engage China from a position of strength. It's also the best basis, by the way, upon which to advance cooperation where we have issues of clear mutual concern, whether it's climate, whether it's non-proliferation, whether it's global health. But let's spend 1 second, though. I want to spend 1 second talking about weakness, because on the issue that is most affecting people around the world and most affecting Americans, the coronavirus, here's what happened. President Obama, Vice President Biden saw pandemics as a growing threat and put in place programs, people, to prevent, detect, and deal with them, including in China. We had a strong CDC presence. We had a dedicated White House office within the National Security Council. We had a program literally called PREDICT to detect the emergence of pandemics. President Trump, he dismantled or defunded virtually all of these efforts. And then when the virus struck and the Chinese government was withholding critical information and denying access to international experts, President Trump repeatedly praised the government's transparency and cooperation and thanked President Xi repeatedly. And then, of course, he walked away from the World Health Organization in the midst of a pandemic instead of working to reform it, ceding our leadership to China. So that's what's happened. And that has put us in a terrible position because it's exacerbated the problems we're facing at home. By the way, at the very time that President Trump was doing this, Joe Biden was publicly warning him not to trust the government in Beijing and imploring him to fight to get our experts in. Tragically, that did not happen.
Tony, do you accept the proposition that we need a constructive and pragmatic relationship with China, recognizing where we have conflict and confrontation, but also where we can collaborate on issues like you say, climate change and pandemic? Do you think there is a narrative that suggests that we can do both? We can balance our challenges with China with our own recognition that we need to work with China as two of the most powerful nations in the world today?
Yes, absolutely. And indeed, that's exactly why I think we have to restore a strong foundation of our own so that we can engage, as I said, China from a position of strength. And that is the best basis upon which to cooperate with China on these issues of clear mutual concern. And we've managed to do it in the past, climate change being perhaps the best example. So my hope is that we can get
that also require China's behavior to change. I mean, you're talking about working from a strength, the United States improving its competitiveness to deal with China, but China should be moving on its own accord to really affect change in its own system in the way it responds to international rules, whether it's trade, whether it's technology issues, and frankly, on issues like climate change and health. China has responsibility here too, right?
Oh, absolutely. But there's only so much that we can control. And the first thing we can control is our own actions, our own investments, our own focus, our own strength. And I think if we do that and get our own house in order and also get the larger house in order, which is working once again with our partners and allies, we're going to be in a much better position to influence the direction that China takes. Think about it this way, just on trade alone. Acting alone, the United States is, what, 25% of world GDP. When we're actually acting in concert with allies and partners, it's 50 or 60% of world GDP. A lot harder for the government in Beijing to ignore.
Okay, let me bring in now the Australian ambassador, Ambassador Sinodinos. Let me bring you into the conversation because China and the United States is dominating not only the discord between the United States and China, but the rest of the world is paying attention. So, Ambassador, some reflections, a question for our guest, Tony Blinken. Ambassador, thank you.
Thanks very much, Tony, and thank you for making yourself available in this way. It's pretty brave in the run-up to what's going to be a pretty contested election, but we value your perspectives. From the perspective of the region, the Indo-Pacific, when we hear about the US talking about doing more with allies, the first question that really comes to mind is, what does that mean in practice? I mean, what is the US prepared to do? What is it prepared to do on trade? You mentioned before, there's been a recrudescence of protectionist pressures, for example. What would the US do to promote greater trade, including in the Indo-Pacific? Does that involve potentially reviewing things like American participation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership? And then the strategic level, given the evolving mechanisms in the region, the US has been very active in recent times with the Quad, with Japan, Australia, and India becoming more active, and the rest, other structures in the region. How does the US demonstrate in a practical way that greater engagement and working with partners in the region, given that the Indo-Pacific is where, frankly, a lot of the focus is going to have to be the center of gravity of global economic activity, and geopolitical competition has clearly shifted there. So would value your reflections on that.
Tony, as you respond to that, let me just add in some other flashpoints for your consideration. Sure. How do you deal with the South China Sea issue? How do you deal with ambiguity or strategic ambiguity with Taiwan? These are all issues that require our discussions with other players in the East Asia Pacific. So, reflecting on the ambassador's questions, could you handle sort of all these issues in response?
Well, look, first of all, Ambassador, very good to see you and to be with you today. Thanks for joining us. This is something we have some experience with. And of course, during the Obama-Biden administration, we conducted what was called a rebalance toward Asia, toward the Asia Pacific. That was a reflection of the fact that our own interests and our own future is so focused on the Pacific, and that came along with a number of major components, including strengthening significantly our relationships with key allies, whether it was Australia, Japan, Korea, etc., revitalizing the institutions in the region and actually showing up and working with them and through them. Engaging emerging countries like Vietnam, of course, with a strategic component, refocusing our assets, including 60% of our Navy in the Asia Pacific, and of course, working toward greater economic integration with a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. So all of those elements are critical, and I think they would remain very important going forward in a Biden administration. There are a whole series of issues. We probably don't have time to go through each of them. But again, I think when you start by getting your own house in order and focusing on your own assets and strength, and then bring the combined weight of partners and allies together, you're in a much better position to affect change and move the region in a positive direction than you are retreating and or acting alone. And I think when it comes to the government in Beijing, they also respect acting forthrightly, acting directly, and making clear that we are going to follow interests. I'll give you one quick example that some of you are familiar with from the time. During the Obama-Biden administration, the government in Beijing declared a so-called air defense identification zone in airspace around China, saying that planes had to identify themselves if they wanted to fly through it, even though it's not their airspace. Joe Biden, then vice president, went to Xi Jinping and told him in a very matter-of-fact way that we were going to ignore the air defense identification zone that China had declared. We were going to fly our planes through it. And that's exactly what we did. We flew bombers right through it. The issue went away. There are a whole series of issues where, when you engage the government directly and forthrightly, for example, on cyber means to engage in commercial theft, which was rampant until we forged an agreement that China was, according to our intelligence community, respecting. When you act in that way, you can get results. But a lot of this, again, starts with making the investments in ourselves and, once again, putting value on our partnerships and alliances, value that has gone bankrupt in the last 3.5 years.
Tony, I'm going to just one quick follow-up here. Ambassador asked you whether you would consider a TPP-like structure. Would you rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership or consider some kind of quad arrangement or something akin in the economic sphere? And I would ask also, would the Biden administration consider a second phase 2 agreement? You can repackage it, but basically to get at technology and data issues and subsidy practices of China. Are these things that you would consider in a Biden administration?
Well, the problem with phase 2, of course, is at the rate we're going, we're never going to get to it because phase 1 has already been a debacle. We've had an administration that engaged in a tariff war that did tremendous damage to our farmers, to our manufacturers, to our consumers. And the end result was the so-called phase 1 deal that doesn't address any of the issues, Myron, you just cited, the systemic issues that are truly at the root of the problem. And even on its own very limited basis, China is not making good on the commitments that it made. And so we've suffered tremendous pain for virtually no gain. So we would have to come back and actually engage on the systemic issues that continue to pose a real problem when it comes to our commercial relationship with China. Look, more broadly, 95% of the world's consumers live beyond our borders. We need to be able to engage them. We need to be able to build the very best here in the United States. We need to be able to sell it around the world. And at the same time, if we're not engaged in writing the rules and establishing the norms and animating the institutions that govern trade among nations, we're going to be at a disadvantage. But here's the problem. It's also more critical than ever to bring key stakeholders along from the takeoff, not just at the landing, because more than ever before, these stakeholders, because of technology, because of information, have in effect veto power over the decisions of national governments. If you can't bring them along, you're not going to get a sustainable outcome. So when we're thinking about trade writ large, we're very focused on American competitiveness, on our ability to compete and succeed in world trade. And in our judgment, our workers, our businesses can outcompete anyone, hands down, if their government is fighting like heck for them, for every job, especially against unfair foreign trade practices. So what does that mean for us? It means that we will first be looking to make major investments here at home in our workers, in our communities, equipping them to compete, equipping them to succeed in education, in infrastructure, in research and development. Second, we will consistently and aggressively enforce American trade laws anytime foreign cheating poses a threat to American jobs. By the way, we would use tariffs when they're needed, but backed by a strategy, a plan to use them to succeed, not to fake toughness and to harm our own people instead of getting results. Organizations like the WTO need a lot of reform to actually address problems that they weren't designed to deal with, but even they can be an effective tool. We brought 16 cases against China during the Obama-Biden administration to the WTO. We won every single one of them. And then, as I mentioned earlier, when we're working with our partners to deal with, for example, Chinese trade practices that are problematic, we're much better off than doing it alone. When you've got 50 or 60% of world GDP lined up, it's a lot harder for China or anyone else to ignore. But we also have to get in on the deal from the takeoff. Trade experts from organized labor, from the environmental movement, to work on negotiating agreements, to be at the table, not simply the recipient of a product that's produced behind closed doors. Again, if we don't do that, then whatever deal we reach is unlikely to be sustained. So there are a lot of things I think we can and should do to put ourselves in a position to drive fairer trade and to get us to a place where we actually get sustainable agreements that are win-wins and not a race to the bottom.
So, Tony, I'll leave it at this. The Obama administration was an advocate for TPP, and actually I was there when Hillary Clinton gave a speech in Cambodia because I introduced her, and she talked about TPP as not just an economic tool, but a foreign policy tool. I want to shift to what the Trump administration has done in using tools of economic stagecraft to pursue foreign policy goals. And I don't want to get into details right now about TikTok or WeChat or Huawei, but I do want to make the point that national security and commerce have come together in this administration and blended in ways that are complicated for the business community to navigate through. But they're important issues. It's important that we recognize the national security issues that we're addressing with China and other countries. And to bring that to light, I want to ask Karan Bhatia from Google maybe to offer a comment and question. Karan?
Thanks, Myron. Hey, Tony, it's good to see you.
Nice to see you.
So just to follow up on Myron's lead in there, look, technology has really sort of become the pointy end of the spear on international economic policy, particularly, I think, with respect to China. And there's always, as you well know, been a relationship among technology, national security, and economic policy. But I think it's fair to say that today's sort of trade policy, trade negotiations, traditionally focused on opening up markets, on building connections, on strengthening institutions, has really kind of been overtaken by export controls, by investment restrictions. Most recently, obviously, as we've been seeing play out in the newspapers, the headlines in recent days, you've seen apps being banned, you've seen forced sale of assets. So really sort of a two-part question for you. One is more specifically on the U.S.-China front, what sort of relationship do you foresee in the U.S.-China technology space? And then more broadly, how do you see, or what do you see as being the right relationship between national security and strategic issues on the one hand and international economic policy more broadly on the other?
Profoundly important question. It's dominating a lot of thinking now. I think it would have to dominate in many ways the work and actions of the next administration. Look, trying to fully decouple, as some have suggested, from China, I think is unrealistic and ultimately counterproductive. We benefit tremendously from attracting students, talent, ideas, investment from around the world, including from China, and it would be a mistake to try to shut that off. I think the question is more, how do you get the balance right? Because we do need, as Myron was suggesting a few minutes ago, to reset the terms of our economic and technology relationship with China, and of course respond to illegal, unfair, anti-competitive practices, including unfair support for and subsidies for state-owned enterprises, market access restrictions, technology transfer requirements, intellectual property theft. All of that needs to be addressed. And the other thing I think that COVID-19 has brought home is the need to focus more on reshoring some essential goods and services, building stockpiles and strategic reserves, developing more diverse and more resilient supply chains. For example, we should make sure that we do not have to rely on any one country, be it China or anyone else, for critical supplies in a crisis again. And so pharmaceutical companies and pharmaceuticals, medical supplies and equipment should be made in the United States, and we should ramp up some of the stockpiles of critical made in America supplies, maintain some surge capacity to produce necessary equipment if there's an emergency, and then work with our closest partners to ensure we have access to additional capacity when we need it. We have the challenge of cyber theft. We talked about that earlier. We actually got an agreement in 2015, negotiated by the Obama-Biden administration, that set forth very clear demands and specific consequences if China did not cease espionage against U.S. businesses that were literally putting our companies out of business and putting our workers out of jobs. And that agreement was hard fought to get to. But as I said earlier, at least when I was still in government, our intelligence community assessed that China was largely living up to that agreement. Unfortunately, it's fallen back from that. And there are a whole series of things we can do, I think, in that area. But the larger question is this. And first, I should say one other thing about this. Look, I don't think there's anything inconsistent with national resilience in critical goods, supplies, and robust engagement in global trade and commerce. If we extended it to every supply chain and every product, that would be one thing. But we're talking about a pretty rigorous process where we identify things that are actually critical to our national security, our safety, and our health. And some of you will remember, Vice President Biden's been talking about Buy America provisions. They were actually in the 2009 Recovery Act that helped us rebound from the financial crisis. And at the time, the WTO said they were WTO consistent. There's a lot more we can do, including meaningful reform, for example, in government procurement, including the agreement that's out there that China's not a part of, unfortunately, to establish a better baseline where taxpayer dollars actually can go to support jobs and supply chains at home. But the last thing is this, Karnan, just to get into the broader question, because you're dealing with this every day. We also need to bring allies and partners in on all of these deals, working together to set rules of the road and coordinate on technology policy, including on export controls, including on investment restrictions, including on technology standards. Because one of the things that we're seeing is a world that is dividing to some extent along a fault line between techno-democracies on the one hand and techno-autocracies on the other hand. And the techno-democracies have to do a much better job in working together, thinking together, acting together to try to set the standard. And I hope that would be a standard that would be shared around the world, and that the model that we put forward actually carries the day. But at the very least, we need to make sure that democracies are living in a technologically democratic world. And that's maybe the biggest challenge that we have before us, especially since there are, of course, real differences among the techno-democracies in thinking about a lot of these issues. I can tell you that a Biden administration would focus very hard on bringing the techno-democracies together, and that, of course, requires a lot more work, a lot more engagement, a lot more cooperation between government and the private sector. No government can or should do this alone, and I hope we can get to a place where we're working together in a thoughtful manner.
Tony, that's a great lead-in to my next set of questions for you, because we're going to talk about some of the things that you have outlined, which is the importance of multilateralism, the importance of strengthening and rebuilding our alliance partners. Karan, by the way, great question. I like the fact that you're more casually dressed than Tony and I. It reflects the Google lifestyle. But Tony, let me turn to something that you keep talking about, and I want to now get a little bit more specificity from. So if you want to work on climate change and sustainability, which has clearly been a priority for the Biden camp to talk about the importance of these issues, you want to talk about trade rules and building up institutions like the WTO. We agree with reforming the WHO, but obviously staying engaged from our perspective is the answer. And of course, multilateral organizations like NATO. I want to ask you a little bit about how you prioritize engagement with Europe in a set of complex issues that you've outlined already, whether it's dealing with China, whether it's dealing with climate change, whether it's reviving and revising and reinvigorating the multilateral system, the WTO, WHO, when we're still confronting huge domestic challenges around the pandemic. So how do you balance the rise of China, the need to focus on that, with engagement with Europe and the issues at home? How would a Biden administration approach this?
So Myron, this really goes to the heart of Vice President Biden's thinking. As you know, we were talking about this at the very beginning, reaffirming, strengthening our core alliances and partnerships with democratic countries is probably his leading international priority, sort of systemically. And that starts with Europe, which has been our partner of first, not last resort for as long as I can remember. And so that means a bunch of practical things. It means actually returning to our seat at NATO's table, not actively moving to get the United States out of NATO, as we've heard reported about President Trump. It means engaging the European Union instead of urging countries to leave it and treating it like it's an enemy. It means, again, working in concert with our closest partners on common challenges, including China's commercial practices. Again, you know, there's the widely reported story when President Macron went to President Trump early on and said we should work together to deal with the common challenge that China poses to all of us in the commercial space. It's reported that President Trump said to him, basically, forget it, the EU is even worse. If that's your worldview, you're not going to get anywhere. But then one of the things that the vice president feels very strongly about, as I said at the outset, is actually reinvigorating the community of democracies. He has talked about holding a summit of democracies very early on in his term to think together, to reason together, and ultimately to act together about how we deal with the common set of challenges we each face at home, because there's so many common denominators to the crisis in democracy across countries: trust in governance, democratic backsliding, inequities, corruption, and then work to try to realign some of our strategic approaches to key issues. And again, that starts, I think, with the US and Europe. We got to repair trade and economic relations that have been in disarray. We got to align climate change and energy security policies. We have to, I think, jumpstart NATO-EU security cooperation on threats to our own institutions. For example, illicit financial operations, election interference, which we're experiencing right now, once again, and try to develop a common strategic vision and a roadmap for countering challenges, whether it's coming from Russia or China in different ways, or Iran. But here's the thing, and this is the last point I want to make on this, but it's important. It is not enough to go back to the way things were. We have to develop new policies, new approaches to deal with new common challenges. We alluded to a couple of them, whether it's AI or outer space, asymmetric threats, misinformation, and this challenge we were talking about a minute ago, the competition between techno-democracies and techno-autocracies. So setting democratic standards in emerging technology and AI, especially, for example, to counter things like digital surveillance, that model being exported by China, working with the EU and EU member states to develop a technology ecosystem that protects and promotes liberal democratic values, as I said, building consensus among other US partners and democratic states on data privacy on 5G. Not easy, but that's something we need to tackle. Bolstering our common defenses against technology theft, against the forced transfer of technology, boosting shared R&D and innovation among transatlantic partners, and a wider network, I think, of democratic states. And finally, last point is really important. We tend to approach our conversations, our partnerships with Europe and with Asia separately. Vice President thinks that these concentric circles need to be joined more, and we need to be talking, thinking, and acting together, not in a European silo, a transatlantic silo, and a trans-Pacific silo.
Well, on many of these issues, you can't do that. You can't work in a silo basis to deal with global challenges, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's sustainability. Any of these issues require global solutions, not just a European and US solution. I would say that you should look to the National Endowment for Democracy and organizations like NDI and IRI and CIPE, which I belong to, the Center for International Private Enterprise. When you talk about democracy and private enterprise, these are organizations that are set up by the Congress to actually support those goals overseas in markets around the world. I want to push you a little bit again on trade. You haven't talked about the EU-US trade negotiations, but I remember when Obama was in power, when he was president, negotiating with Michael Froman, then Ambassador Froman, about the concept of TTIP, the EU-US negotiation. Now we have the current administration talking about also a UK-US trade agreement. How do these kinds of issues factor into your transatlantic concept? And before you answer that, I want to bring in the EU ambassador, Lambrinidis, to offer his reflections on the importance of the transatlantic relationship and the importance of building on our economic ties and not letting irritants in the relationship on the trade front color our judgment on how to work together. Ambassador?
Thank you, Myron, and thank you, Tony, for taking the time. Much appreciate being here. I think, Myron, you've asked most of the key questions. So there's no question that the transatlantic relationship is the biggest trade investment relationship in the world. the biggest source of prosperity and security for both sides. But there's also no question that there have been irritants in the past, as you're saying. And, inevitably, its perceived added value has been different for different administrations over the years. So I think I would like to ask Tony a broader question, which is, given all this, what would a Biden administration see as the key opportunities to be explored on a bilateral basis and the key challenges to be addressed immediately? In foreign policy, in which particular of the many U.S. interests that you outlined do you see a special EU added value as opposed to the US going it alone? And if I may focus on one of them, which is climate change, do you see pursuing a different kind of energy mix in the States, different kinds of policy as a danger to US competitiveness that the Biden administration, as you said, is putting such an emphasis on? Or not? In the EU context, the recent speech of the president of the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, indicated that the EU plans to go full steam ahead with green transition by 2050. And finally, when it comes to Buy America that you mentioned before, do you see also potential downsides to this when it comes to US competitiveness, or when it comes to the most competitive prices and goods for US consumers and companies, as they also insource from abroad? And what is the right balance there that you plan to strike?
Great. So good to see you, my friend, and a lot packed in there.
Respond to.
Let me tackle some of this at least. Starting just with the big picture when it comes to the EU and trade. Look, on one level, it's pretty simple. The EU is the largest market in the world. We need to improve our economic relations, and we need to bring to an end, I think, an artificial trade war that the Trump administration has started, which is in many ways a self-inflicted wound that has been poisoning relations, costing jobs, increasing costs for consumers. Instead of hurting our own citizens and fighting with our own democratic allies, we ought to be working on a fair approach to international trade and investment. And I think we believe that there is scope, ample scope, to increase trade from what's already a sizable base. But again, I want to go back to what I said before. The Vice President's very focused on making sure we're making the investments in our own people so that we can compete effectively. And look, we all know this. Trade liberalization's never an easy thing, even more so in the current environment. But if we're going to make progress anywhere, having made the investments in our own people, we ought to be able to do it when it comes to the U.S. and the European Union. And after all, at least from a macro perspective, we've got the same basic goals and desires for high standards regarding the environment, regarding labor, regarding IP protections, etc. There is an objective problem, I think, with the EU in terms of a persistent growing imbalance in agricultural goods trade because of rules that prevent us from selling goods where we are very competitive. On the other hand, European friends will say that we need to look at transatlantic trade holistically, not only through the lens of goods. So if you bring in services, the income we earn from American affiliates in Europe, we've got a more balanced picture. But bottom line is, there is room to move this up, and it's something that we would want to focus on. But we need to get our own house in order. On climate, look, there too, there's a fairly simple proposition from the American perspective, which is we are about 15% of global emissions. And so by definition, even if we get everything right at home, if we're not dealing with the other 85% of emissions that are coming from other countries, we don't solve the problem. Conversely, if we're not actually demonstrating ourselves that we're serious about tackling what is an existential challenge, it's a lot harder for us to bring other countries along and to move things in a much more accelerated and positive direction. So I won't bore you with the details, and for those who are interested, check out the website. We have a very significant climate plan that involves significant investment in green technology, among other things. This can be an absolute win-win for climate and for the economy. And then we have a very aggressive plan to move on this internationally, not just rejoining Paris, but also working to get our allies, partners, and others to raise their ambitions, because we don't have any time to lose. We're already behind the curve. So I'd like to think that's an area, again, where the United States and Europe can be working and leading together.
Tony, there's a lot of ground still to cover, so I want to just ask you real quickly on Russia. You referenced it once or twice in this conversation. It's apparent to a lot of us that Russia is being very aggressive in its posturing in the Middle East, obviously with respect to destabilizing actions in some of its immediate neighborhood, its interference perhaps in our U.S. domestic politics. But there are areas like arms reduction where there's an opportunity. So just real quickly before we turn to the Middle East, a word on Russia. So,
Myron, I've got a piece of paper that I have with me just in case Russia came up, and so forgive me. I'm just going to read something because I think it's pretty instructive, and it's a quote. At bottom of the Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. Russian rulers have invariably sensed that their rule was relatively archaic in form. To this was added, as Russia came into contact with an economically advanced West, fear of a more competent, more powerful, more highly organized societies. For this reason, its rulers have always feared foreign penetration. Russians will participate officially in international organizations where they see an opportunity for extending power or inhibiting or diluting the power of others. Efforts will be made to disrupt Western national self-confidence, to hamstring measures of national defense, to increase social and industrial unrest, to stimulate all forms of disunity. Poor will be set against rich, black against white, young against old, newcomers against established residents, end quote. So that was written in 1946 by a certain George Kennan in his long telegram. And it sounds eerily familiar to me. We're now in a situation where we have President Trump standing next to Vladimir Putin on the world stage and taking his word about Russia's attacks on our elections over that of all of our intelligence agencies. And to me, mind-bogglingly, we have a president of the United States who, upon receiving reports from the intelligence community that Russia was putting bounties on our troops in Afghanistan, did nothing. In fact, he did worse than nothing. By his own acknowledgement, President Trump has spoken to President Putin at least half a dozen times since that report first crossed his desk, and did not confront President Putin once. And even knowing what he knew, he sought to invite President Putin to Washington, back in Russia, back into the G7, etc. So I think we need, and the Vice President believes strongly, that we need to confront Mr. Putin's aggressive actions, not embrace him. We need to stop trashing our NATO alliance and threatening to walk away from it. Instead, we need to be strengthening its deterrence, investing in new capabilities to deal with these new challenges, particularly in cyberspace, outer space, under the sea, AI, electronic warfare, and provide robust security assistance to countries like Ukraine, like Georgia, and the Western Balkans. We need, when it's necessary, in the face of aggressive actions, to impose real costs, coordinated sanctions, exposing corruption. We need to be very clear and specific with Mr. Putin about what he risks, but also perhaps what might be gained in trade and investment, in a seat at the table, if, for example, Russia wanted to relieve dependence on China. And then we need to build our own resilience by hardening our election infrastructure. We're dealing with that now, getting dark money out of politics, pushing tech companies to deal with disinformation. There's also a strategic stability piece that's critical. Vice President Biden would extend New START, and there may be other avenues to explore when it comes to strategic arms moving forward. So there's a lot that can and should be done, but it starts with having a clear-eyed view about what Russia and Mr. Putin are up to, confronting that, not running away from it, and then working from there.
Okay, there's a lot there that I could cover, but let's move on to the Middle East, because I think the Trump administration deserves a lot of credit, and I think you would even say this, for recent efforts to help broker the deal that Israel negotiated with both the UAE and Bahrain. Now, President Trump has asserted that this is the dawn of a new stability for Israel and Arab nations across the region. But of course, the big questions of Israel's relationship with Palestinians, the questions around Sunni and Shia regimes are still out there and loom large over the Middle East. And at the same time, you could argue the business community has made more investments in the region, but we're less dependent on oil. So the oil politics have changed as well. I want to bring in David Sanger, who you know well is the national security correspondent for the New York Times, to perhaps ask a question about Iran and anything else. So David, floor is yours.
Great, good to be with you, Tony, and thanks for doing this. I wanted to ask you about Iran, and if you permit me, do one follow-up on what you just said about Russia. So the Iran that you're going to confront if Vice President Biden is elected in November isn't quite the Iran that you left on January 20th, 2017. So you've said before you want to get back into the Iran agreement, but I'm assuming that you don't want to get back into it in exactly the form that it was in, that you want to go deal with the expiring timelines, which will seem a lot closer now. You'll want to go deal with their malign activities in the Middle East. You'll want to deal with their cyber activities against the U.S. So tell us a little bit about how you would imagine reconfiguring the Iran deal if you went back into it. And on Russia, you just raised the election interference and so forth, and you and I have discussed what Putin's doing to interfere in 2020. I'm not sure I've heard from Vice President Biden what he would do if he was in office now to push back on the Russians between now and election day. Would you authorize the NSA to go take the kind of measures that they say publicly they took in 2018 to go close down Russian sites in the IRA? Would you do something with economic sanctions? What exactly would the vice president do if he was in office today facing exactly the situation you're facing?
Thanks, David. Always good to be with you. So very quickly, let me just try and touch on a few of these things. First, with regard to Russian election interference, Vice President actually put out what I think was a very strong and pretty explicit statement, maybe 8 weeks ago, on what he would do and what he will do as president in the face of efforts to interfere in our elections, whether it's from Russia or anyone else. And I would just invite you to take a look at that. I don't think I'd go any further than that statement today, but it was pretty explicit in the kinds of steps he would take using all of the authorities available to him as president of the United States. Myron, and I'll come to the Iran piece in a second. Myron, I just want to mention in reference to your lead-in, yes, Vice President welcomes the normalization moves by the UAE and Bahrain with Israel. He applauded them publicly, and we welcome the work that the administration did to move those forward. These kinds of moves were exactly the kinds of things that we were also in previous administrations worked on, including the vice president during his own final trip to Israel as vice president, and the UAE. I think this is in the spring of 2016. And certainly we would continue to encourage that if he becomes president. In one sense, of course, it reflects practical reality, which is the UAE and Bahrain have not been in a state of war with Israel. On the contrary, as a practical matter, cooperation has been wide and deep. But there's real power to the symbolism of normalization, as well as some of the practical things that hopefully flow from it. So it's a good thing. Having said that, I don't think ignoring the Israel-Palestine dimensions will make them go away. Two states remains the only way to ensure Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state, and to fulfill the Palestinian right to a state of their own. And so it's not going to be, just like the coronavirus, something that is miraculously going to disappear. Now, we're a long way from being in a place where we can see progress on that front. So I think the first order of business is first do no harm, and then hopefully work toward conditions that are more conducive to engagement and progress. But we ignore it. We try and put it in a drawer at our peril. It is not going away. So David, on the Iran piece, a couple of things. I think it is fair to say that President Trump, in tearing up the Iran agreement, has put us in a very, very difficult place. When he walked away from the deal, an agreement that was verifiably working to block Iran's path to a nuclear weapon, particularly its ability to produce fissile material on very short order for a weapon, he told us he was going to get a better deal and that his pressure would make Iran less provocative, less dangerous. And of course, the opposites happened. Iran is building back its nuclear capability. In effect, the president freed Iran of its own commitments, and it now is enriching uranium at higher levels, and its stockpile has grown significantly. It's using more advanced centrifuges. The breakout time necessary for Iran to have enough nuclear material to create a weapon has decreased from more than 1 year, which it was under the agreement, to a handful of months based on what's been publicly reported. And the extraordinary access that we got for international inspectors has in some places been blocked. This is all happening under President Trump's watch. The other problem is, by withdrawing from the deal, the president effectively isolated us from our closest allies and also encouraged Russia and China to move closer to Tehran. And that undermined our ability to work with the very countries we need to check its destabilizing actions elsewhere. So we also, of course, had the promise that a pressure campaign on Iran with new sanctions that our allies oppose would actually stop its aggressive actions. Instead, we saw Iran become more aggressive. No surprise. Obviously, it was going to react to the pressure being exerted. It became more aggressive in the region, not less, in responding to the sanctions. It targeted oil tankers in the Gulf, infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, our own troops in Iraq. It downed an American drone. As all of these tensions escalated, we came pretty close to the brink of conflict on at least 3 occasions by my count. The president has sent thousands of additional forces to the Middle East at a time we should be trying to end the forever wars. And then, you know, after that attack on the Saudi oil facility and the death of an American contractor in Iraq, we had, of course, the strike that took out Qasem Soleimani. No one is shedding any tears for his demise. But it's one thing to take him out. It's another to game out and deal with the totally predictable consequences, which we didn't do. And of course, there was an Iranian strike with dozens of ballistic missiles on a U.S. base. 100 American service members had traumatic brain injuries, which the president dismissed as headaches. The bottom line is we've walked away from diplomacy, we've acted erratically, and we've made conflict more likely. And now, you've been following this, and others have been following this, we have the conventional arms embargo, which is now expiring. So the United States launches an effort to extend it indefinitely at the UN. And we get a grand total of 1 out of 15 members of the Security Council to support our effort. Russia and China were able to keep their veto ink dry. It was a diplomatic debacle. Now we're invoking the sanctions snapback provisions in the JCPOA negotiated by the Obama-Biden administration. There's one catch. Those snapback provisions can be invoked by participants to the agreement. In pulling out of the Iran deal, the administration literally headlined its press release ending U.S. participation in the JCPOA. So we have our partners saying, you can't invoke snapback. You're no longer a participant in the agreement. So what would we do? Look, I can't get into the details of how we would do this step by step. But if Tehran returns to compliance with the agreement, we would also do the same thing and then use this renewed commitment and platform to strengthen and lengthen the deal. That also has the merit, David, I think, of putting us back in sync with our partners who've been spending all of their efforts and energy trying to preserve the deal instead of working with us to confront Iran where it needs to be confronted and effectively pushing back against its destabilizing activities. We've been isolated, not Iran. That would end if we're able to move back. But as you rightly suggest, it has gotten more complicated. There are new facts that need to be dealt with. I don't want to get ahead of how we would do it. I can just tell you, as the Vice President has said, as a basic proposition, if Iran comes back into compliance, we would, and then we would work to strengthen and lengthen.
Tony, we're going to have to leave it on that, unfortunately. We got to move on to one last topic. I'm not going to get to every issue I wanted to get to, which is fine because your answers have been very full, and I appreciate that, and I think our viewers appreciate it as well. But I want to talk about the Western Hemisphere. You said something earlier, and I just want to pick up on it. You said that a Biden administration really would spend a lot of time focusing on bringing labor to the table on trade issues. I would argue the Trump administration deserves a lot of credit for bringing labor into the context of the USMCA negotiations. And in fact, Speaker Pelosi spent a lot of time working with Ambassador Lighthizer and many members of the House Democratic Party engaged very actively, as did Trumpka, in these negotiations. The business community, on balance, said this was a good deal to upgrade the North America Free Trade Agreement. But most of the rest of the time of the administration so far has been focused on isolating Venezuela and Cuba when it comes to the region. But there are huge issues, from rule of law to narcotics to cross-regional issues around poverty. This is a region that has been hit very hard by the pandemic, by the coronavirus. Debt levels are very high to come. There are issues around the ability of these governments and the institutions within these governments to withstand the pressures that they're confronting in years to come. I wonder if a Biden presidency would have the ability to engage systemically on cross-regional issues. Before you respond to that, I wanted to bring in Ambassador Barcenea for her comments, and then we'll turn to you, Tony. Ambassador? Martha, are you there?
Yes. Sorry. Thank you very much, Myron. Thank you very much, Mr. Blinken. It's a pleasure to be here. It's certainly what Myron has delineated, that some of the challenges that we have in Latin America and Mexico are key. We have been badly hit by the pandemic, but I can identify a couple of issues that I would like to listen for you, and also in the relationship with Mexico, that it might be maybe not the most consequential, but the most complex relationship that the US has. Just sharing a huge border, a trade of more than $600 billion a year. Just the trade between Mexico and Michigan is the equivalent of the trade between the UK and China, just to make some comparisons. But how are you foreseeing to deal with one issue that I think it's at the core of the Biden campaign, and it's at the core of Latin America, which is the issue of inequality and social justice? It's not just poverty, but how do we tackle the issue of inequality and social justice together, and with which tools? Should it be trade? Should it be more a cooperation approach, as you were defining as one of the three main issues of the Biden foreign policy? How are you planning to engage with the Latin American countries on these matters, and particularly with Mexico? What would be your priority in the engagement with Latin America and Mexico? And that is something that I think we all in Latin America are very willing to listen. So what would be the differences in this engagement?
Well, thank you, Ambassador Myron. Thanks very much as well for bringing this into the conversation, because I'm glad we're finishing to something that is really central to the Vice President's thinking, and also to his own focus and even passion. One quick word on the USMCA. The reason it's a good deal is precisely because Nancy Pelosi, Democrats in Congress, and Labor took what was not a good deal and made it a good one. Made it something that I think we can all support, and that's vital. The original draft, as negotiated by the Trump administration, included a lot of provisions and some pretty substantial ones that were not good for labor, not good for the environment, and ultimately not good for our prosperity. Thankfully, Democrats in Congress, led by Nancy Pelosi, and the labor movement were able to improve it. But you know, that's the way things can and should work. So, good thing. I would say more broadly on Latin America. Look, I think the administration's approach, the current administration's approach, has been based mostly on bullying and insulting our neighbors, not on trying to build common cause in a variety of areas or stronger ties. I can tell you that Vice President Biden believes very, very strongly that a secure, middle-class, and democratic hemisphere is profoundly in the interests of the United States, in our economic interests, in our national security interests, and of course, it happens to be in the interest of people living throughout the hemisphere. Vice President knows Latin America, the Caribbean, very well. He's traveled frequently to the region during his time in the White House, including numerous trips to Mexico. I think the most important thing is that he understands that successful diplomacy in the region can only take place on the basis of respect and sustained engagement. Here's a good example, and it affects Mexico, although it's not directly about it. You'll remember this. As vice president, he led a major bipartisan effort to address some of the drivers that were pushing people to flee the Northern Triangle countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, relieving pressure on our respective borders by working to improve security and justice, by combating corruption, by reducing inequality, by expanding economic opportunity. And for that program, he managed to secure more than $700 million from a Republican Congress, showing that bipartisan action is still possible. And that aid was tied to concrete reforms, not a giveaway, but tied to concrete reforms. And by a bunch of measures, we were actually making some progress. This came pretty late in the administration, but we were making progress. Unfortunately, the Trump administration got away from what I think was a sound strategy and replaced it with a lot of hostility and inflammatory rhetoric. Now, even more so, during this period of COVID-19, Vice President has a deep empathy for those who are suffering the most. And I think realizes that addressing hemispheric inequality, now accentuated by COVID-19, has to be front and center. There are a whole host of ways that we can and should do this. And again, I would invite you to check out some of the things that we've put online, because I know we're way over time. But I would just say that it actually starts with respect, with treating each other with dignity. And when you do that, you can get a lot done.
Tony, we're not going to do justice to the Western Hemisphere, and we're not going to do justice to two other pieces of the portfolio, which is India and Africa, which I think deserve also time and attention. But I have two final questions, and they're going to be very brief. One is, if there was one Eric Clapton song that you would pick out, what would that song be?
Impossible question. I'm sorry, I just can't give you an answer. I mean,
you have to give me an answer. One song that stands out in your mind.
No, I would just take the entire Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs double album. I'd have to take the whole thing. That's it.
Second question. It's a silly question to ask you, but if Biden is successful in winning the election, will you be willing to serve the country?
If asked, of course. I mean, look, in all seriousness, at this time in particular, I don't think anyone would turn down the call to serve. We have multiple crises taking place in an almost perfect storm, Myron, at the same time. The health aspects of COVID-19, the economic aspects, and of course, profound challenges with racial inequities in our own country and around the world, a community of democracies that's in disarray. So there's so much to be done, and anyone who has any interest in these issues, this is a time you really want to be doing whatever you can in whatever small way you can to try to move the ball forward.
Okay, with that, let me thank all the guests for coming on today, and most importantly, let me thank Tony Blinken for his candor and his directness in responding to a whole range of questions and doing that in such an effective way. Tony, we look forward to hearing from you in the future, and of course, we'll have another forum, another InSTEP forum soon to come, probably focused on corporate leadership at this challenging time, and we'll hear the perspectives of a number of CEOs with regard to where we're going as a country and the role of the business community. With that, thank Tony, all the guests, and everyone for participating today. Look forward to hearing from you in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you all.